not about the technology, it's about the narrative. It's not the best technology that wins, it's always the best story that wins with human beings. And there are countless examples of this through history. VHS was the standard that dominated the plastic box movie industry, right? But it wasn't the best technology. There was another technology called Betamax that Sony had developed that was far superior. Unfortunately, Betamax didn't have as good a story to tell. And it's always the best story that wins. So when you hear somebody going, have you heard about this new coin that's better than Bitcoin because it can make sandwiches in space or whatever, remember that. It might be a better technology, but it ultimately doesn't matter. And one of my first tests for any new cryptocurrency is, do we know who the founder is? Because we're talking about money, baby. We are not talking about sandwiches or flying cars or anything else. We're talking about the most important thing in society, right? And think about what happens when you have a name attached to an idea that big. In the cryptocurrency world, for example, there's another cryptocurrency called Ethereum, and last year somebody spread a rumor that Vitalik Buterin, who's the founder of Ethereum, that he had died in a car accident and the Ethereum price tanked. That's what happens when you have individuals who are just human beings attached to an idea, and everybody knows they're human beings. Satoshi is above all of that. Satoshi can't die in a car accident. Satoshi won't be outed as part of the Me Too movement, and we'll all find out he's a bit of a creep. Nobody knows who Satoshi is, and so Satoshi is a little bit like a god, right? And if we believe in Satoshi and we believe in this grand idea, it will outlive whoever Satoshi is or was. There's reason to believe that a big part of the Satoshi project was Dave Kleiman, who passed away in 2013. Of course, we know Hal Finney was very closely involved, a cryptographer, genius man who died in 2011, which could explain why Satoshi's been quiet since then. But I digress. It's very important that Satoshi remain anonymous, and that's one component of the Bitcoin story that very few, if any, other cryptocurrencies have. Imagine not being able to phone somebody on Vodacom because you're on MTN. That's literally how these networks worked in the early days. Imagine if I couldn't email you because you were using Gmail and I was using Outlook. Ridiculous as an idea. But we keep making that mistake over and over again. We seem to think it's fine that I can post something to Facebook and you won't see it on Twitter. You can't see it if you're a Twitter user. You have to go to Facebook. How is that different from email, right? So that's a centralized network. And it's how the world of money has worked until now. The opposite end of the spectrum is what we call a distributed network, where all of the nodes have direct access to each other and they don't have to work through the central loci of control. Now, the curious thing about a distributed information network like that is that it changes the rules. Rules that are true for centralized networks become false for decentralized networks. It changes the economies as well. For example, we have well understood business principles like first mover advantage that are true in a network where there is scarcity to control and false in a network where there's abundance. Right? It actually turns the rule on its head. Another rule is that if you look at a star network, you can control it by capturing a centralized node. If you're a government and you control this, you control access, end of story. The opposite happens if you try to control a node in a decentralized network like this, because there's always a way around you. And this is the only game in town, ladies and gentlemen. These are how information networks work. Now, these are extremes. We never have full centralization. We never have full distribution. We have something in the middle, what we call decentralized networks, where some nodes are more prominent than others, but there's always a way to route around them. And that's what the Bitcoin network is. And it's the first of its kind for several reasons. Firstly, we haven't had networks like this in the world of money for as long as we've had central banking. Now, for the first time, thanks to the internet and thanks to mathematics, we can do at scale what early human beings did in tribal societies. As humanity, as a planet, we can create a transactional network where we can transact directly with each other, and that trust negotiation happens one-on-one. And we don't need intermediaries to help us. We used to have commodity-backed money. We used to have the gold standard, and I won't go into it because you learned about it at school. But you couldn't just print money in the early 20th century. You had to have something pinning its value, right? You had to have a store of gold that represented the value of the amount of money in the system, etc. We moved away from that standard. There isn't a word for the new standard. There probably is. I'm just not an economist. I call it the bullshit standard on money, right? Because what is bullshit about? It's about making somebody else believe something, right? And so we believe money has value because our governments tell us that they do. We have to trust them. We have to trust that they won't print too much of it. We have to trust that they won't hide some of it away. And if we have that trust in them, which they enforce using a very old trick, they even print it on the money, then everything's hunky-dory. Until it frickin' isn't, as happens from time to time. We're all old enough to remember 2009 and the fun that went down then. And we're now in another stage where we know something is coming. We don't know when and we don't know how, but we know it's coming. What Satoshi suggested was that maybe you don't have to trust that system anymore. In fact, maybe you don't have to trust anybody anymore. Maybe you can just start verifying things for yourself. Because in the Bitcoin blockchain, which is just a ledger of transactions, you can go and consult every transaction that's ever happened. It's impossible to hide a Bitcoin transaction. You can literally take out your smartphone now, go to blockchain.info in your browser, and you can go and query every single Bitcoin transaction that's ever happened. You can see exactly how much was sent from one address to another. You can't see who owns the addresses because privacy is paramount, right? Privacy is a little bit like porridge. You don't want it too hot, you don't want it too cold. You want it somewhere in the middle. Because you don't want governments to be able to just trip over your information. We've seen what happens when they have too much power in that domain. You also don't want it to be completely anonymous so that bad people have a good place to hide. The other interesting thing we're learning in cryptocurrency is that there aren't that many bad people out there, but that's a different story, right? You want it somewhere in the middle, where if the government really wants to catch you and is willing to spend R1 million to do it, they can. But they can't just go and false positive you by accident. Bitcoin gives us all of that. Let's say I have a tiny little safe, and I want to protect something, so I put it in the safe, and then I take my safe to Stuart, who also wants to protect something. He's got a slightly bigger safe, so he puts my little safe in his big safe with the thing he wants to protect, and then that safe goes into another safe. So as more and more Bitcoin transactions happen, the network creates these layers of encryption around the older transactions, and the older a transaction is, the safer it becomes, the more encrypted it becomes. They become what we call immutable. You can't go back and change them. You can't change the date on the transaction. You can't touch it once it's out there. So this network's ticking over and over, and all you need to do to transact with it is you need a private key that connects your address on the blockchain to you, right? A key that unlocks your safe, if you will. And that key, thanks to a standard we call BIP44, can be extrapolated into the English language. So you can have, for example, 12 English words, and if you just remember those 12 words, you have access to your wallet from any computer anywhere in the world. So we call them brain wallets. You just remember the 12 words, and you've installed something better than a Swiss bank account in your brain. And you could have $1 billion worth of Bitcoin stored in your head. You could cross a border, you could get strip searched. Nobody can take it away from you. Nobody even knows it's there. The first Bitcoin transaction that ever happened was in 2009 when Satoshi Nakamoto sent some Bitcoin to Hal Finney. And if you go and look at that transaction, it's still on the blockchain. Satoshi added the headline from the Times newspaper on that day in 2009 when the banks had just announced a second bailout. He added that to the first Bitcoin transaction that was ever made. You might have heard of Backed, made the news a few months ago. This is a consortium that's being led by ICE. ICE is the organization that owns the New York Stock Exchange and several others. Not a small company, right? They're leading this consortium with Microsoft and with Starbucks, also not small companies, to produce the first backed digital security for Bitcoin, which will launch in November this year. But also to lead a working group on how Starbucks can taking Bitcoin payments, how Microsoft can start building it into their Azure and other infrastructure plays, and how the New York Stock Exchange can move onto the blockchain. So this is happening. It's happening next month, and it's happening in Bitcoin. You will have heard through my whole talk, I mentioned the other cryptocurrencies, but really Bitcoin is still the only game in town. So, you might think the game had ended at the end of 2007. I put it to you that it's only just begun. We've spoken about what the rules are now, and even if you don't believe in playing chess that way, it's fun to try. So maybe you want to do that. You don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin, that's another misunderstanding. Of course, Bitcoin costs 100,000 Rand at the moment, but you can buy a tiny fraction. Satoshi thought of all of this. One Bitcoin can be divided into 100 million subunits that we call Satoshis, the same that a US dollar can be divided into 100 cents. So you can go and take 10 Rand, and you can get involved, and you can start playing, and you can see whether or not these rules work for you. Because the technology is ready, the big companies are setting up, and all the future needs right now is some more of you. And that's my talk this morning. I don't have time for Q&A, unfortunately. I think I brought you back onto time. We started 20 minutes late, and I don't suspect I'm going to get those 20 minutes back for Q&A, so off I go.